Good morning and welcome to this webinar that's part of MST and Eastern's virtual open day. My name is Sue Kimber and I serve as Community Life Coordinator here at the college. It's also my privilege this morning to serve as host for this webinar featuring Dr. David Ung. David is MST's program leader for the Master of Missional Leadership program, and he'll be speaking on the subject of serving Jesus in a global world, such an important and timely subject. David and his wife, Jen, along with their 2 kids, have lived in Melbourne for about 2 years. But before that, lived and served in a variety of different contexts, including the US, South Africa, Asia, and Europe. In his spare time, David likes discovering new places and the delicious food he finds there, and learning how to fix old guitars. After David's talk, we'll have a Q&A session, so do feel free to add your questions for David using the Q&A icon you'll find at the bottom of the screen. And for more specific advice about the program David heads, the Master of Missional Leadership, or any other MST or Eastern course, go to the Open Day website and use the live chat feature to talk with one of our inquiries team. Now, give me just a second while I hand over to David.
It's a pleasure for me to join you for this webinar on serving Jesus in a global world. And I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully you can see that. And can I just encourage you from Sue's words really to keep this webinar as interactive as possible by writing down your questions and so that we're ready for the question and answer time. Now, there are lots of things that we could have talked about under this title of serving Jesus in a global world. But today I want to talk about specifically the idea of adapting our lives and ministries as a way in which we serve Jesus in this global world. It's an area that I think has been reinforced to us during this COVID-19 period. I think for us personally, for our churches, our workplaces, there has been and has had to be a lot of rethinking and adaptation. At the start of the year, probably a lot of us had certain thoughts about how the year was going to pan out for our lives, ministries, and work responsibilities, only to have those changed and for us to move into a period of adapting what we're going to be doing this year. But adaptation shouldn't just be something that we only think about during COVID-19, but should be something that we should be constantly be thinking about as disciples of Jesus, faced with an ever-changing world. And so there are all sorts of changes happening in our world today that need for us to rethink how we adapt, how we serve in light of this global world that we're living in. Megatrends, as people have called them, such as globalization, meaning that we're not just living in a more interconnected way, but we're more aware of that in today's world. The growth of non-Western Christianity around the world is also another mega trend that people talk about. And with that, the decline of Western Christianity. You can see some of these statistics now that about more than 60% of the Christians in the world are found in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And when we combine this, these megatrends with population megatrends such as migration, these trends are brought right to our doorstep as our cities become more culturally, socially, and religiously diverse, changing the very cities and the suburbs in which we minister. And so there's one author called Philip Jenkins who, talking specifically, and I won't read the whole quote, but talking specifically about the growth of non-Western Christianity in his book, The Next Christendom, says in the first part of this quote that we are currently living through one of the transforming moments in the history of religion worldwide. So that describes you and me. We are living in one of the transforming moments in the history of religion worldwide. And these changes, as well as COVID-19, should make us really pause to reflect and to pray about whether we are adapting as we serve Jesus in this global world. We should be asking questions like, why actually do we go about our ministries and our mission the way that we currently do? Are there areas that I should have adapted in my ministry even before COVID-19 that I didn't really adapt to? And how should I specifically adapt as I seek to serve Jesus in this global world? Well, with some of these thoughts swirling through our minds as we think about the current world in which we live, I'm going to spend the remainder of this time trying to draw out 3 lessons from a well-known passage in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 to 27. And I want us just to remind ourselves of those words from Paul. Let me just read that out for us. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. Now, before I draw out some lessons, some context is important. And as we're thinking about serving Jesus in a global world. And the first thing to note is that Paul himself was living in a transforming moment in the history of Christianity too. Simply put, it's clear that in the early chapters of the book of Acts, Jerusalem was the center of Christianity. But as God's people are scattered through persecution, other centers grew up, such as Antioch, Philippi, Corinth, and others. And so when we read Corinthians, it's important to remember that Paul is adapting to a world that was very different to Jewish Christianity. He's facing issues that Jewish Christianity has never had to face. So when Paul writes about singleness, marriage, and divorce in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he's able to say some things that have been said before. So in verse 10 of chapter 7, he says, "To the married, I give this command." And then in brackets, he says, "Not I, but the Lord." But he also has to say new things in this new situation that have never been said before. So in verse 12 of chapter 7, he says, "To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord." Now, why does he say this? Well, it's because there are issues that came up in Gentile territory that didn't come up in Jewish territory or Christianity, that Paul is having to rethink and to theologize for a new context. And so that's an important thing to bear in mind, that Paul himself was going through a transforming moment as he crossed those borders into Gentile territory to serve Jesus. The second thing to note is that at the beginning and end of this passage, Paul uses the language of slavery. In verse 19, it says, "Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible." And then if we look at verse 27, Paul says, "No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize." Now, the word slave in Scripture is often translated servant in our Bibles. And essentially, it's a metaphor for the believer's total devotion to Jesus. Jesus is our master, and we belong to him. And so what we're to think about as Paul approaches this new situation at Corinth, this transforming moment, is that he goes into this new situation with a very clear understanding that he is a servant or a slave of Jesus. He's totally devoted to him and belongs to his master and works to adapt as he shares the gospel in this new situation. That's a good reminder for us. See, Paul is serving Jesus in a global world. Well, as we think about that background information with those things in mind, let me draw out 3 lessons from the passage about Paul's service to Jesus. Well, first of all, Paul's service to Jesus was inclusive. In verse 22, we read out that Paul says that I've become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. You see, Corinth was a diverse place. It was a port city and one of the most diverse cities in the first century. It was ethnically diverse. Paul mentions Jews and Gentiles in places like 1 Corinthians 10. And one commentator describes Corinth as a melting pot for Greeks, Syrians, Jews, and resettled Roman veterans. But it was also socially and economically diverse. There were rich and poor, as we read, for example, in 1 Corinthians 11, and when Paul is talking about the Lord's Supper. Places where you live may not be as ethnically diverse as other places, but they may be more socially and economically diverse. And Corinth was also a religiously diverse place. 1 Corinthians 8, for example, talks about many gods. And historically, there was a man called Pausanias who wrote a book called The Description of Greece in the 2nd century. And a bit like the travel shows or the travel guides that you see on TV, he mentions the different religious traditions there. And he said that there were 26 sacred places in the city. In addition to the temple to Aphrodite, there were temples to greater and lesser gods of the Roman and Greek pantheons, Egyptian deities, mystery cults, and at least one Jewish synagogue. And we mustn't also forget the imperial cult. So Paul looked at the city and its diversity, and he wanted to win people from all cultural, all religious, social, and economic backgrounds. And he wanted to adapt his ministry to make that possible. It's a great challenge to us, isn't it, as we're situated in diverse Melbourne or in other cities, wherever we're based. Are we serving Jesus inclusively where we are? Now, the second thing I think we can draw out about Paul's service is that Paul's service to Jesus was also innovative.
What does it mean then to do theology in this context?
It has struck me that Paul can make one of the most conservative statements of the gospel in 1 Corinthians 2:2, when he says these words, and earlier on in the letter. Earlier on in the letter, he says, "For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Now, it's always struck me that Paul can make one of the most conservative statements of the gospel when he says these words, and in the same letter, also make one of the most radical statements of flexibility and gospel adaptation and innovation in those words that we read out earlier, when Paul says, I've become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. Innovation or adaptation is not something that we should be seeing as contrary to faithfulness to the gospel. See, Paul seems to think in the letter to 1 Corinthians that putting the gospel first should lead to innovation rather than stagnation in our ministries and in our lives. And Paul says that he's willing to consider all means in 1 Corinthians 9:22. And by this, he doesn't mean that he's willing to be immoral in order to win the immoral. No, what he's saying is that he's willing to try different things, even laying aside his rights, his right to payment for his ministry, for example, in the context, to serve those who need Christ and put himself out for the salvation of others. And so as Paul is faced with the diversity of the city, he's trying to use approaches that are as diverse as the city itself in order to reach all peoples for the sake of the gospel, all the while remaining faithful to the message of Christ and him crucified. So Paul's service was not only inclusive, it was not only innovative, but finally it was also intentional. And Paul, in this particular point, Paul is talking about how he beats his body and denies himself for the gospel. Now, the imagery here is Olympic imagery. The Corinthians hosted something like the Olympics called the Isthmian Games. It was second only to the Olympics at the time. So they were very familiar with these athletic metaphors that Paul is using, of running and boxing. And what Paul does here is that he commands all Christians to run the race as he does, to run in such a way as to get the prize, to live sacrificially, counting the cost and going into strict training, all of which require intentionality. And this is what Paul does as he seeks to become all things to all people. It's not something that's just going to fall on his lap. He has to be intentional about it. And it's a challenge to us as we adapt to the global realities of our time, that we show this kind of intentionality in reaching those who are different to us and in adapting our lives and ministries to do so. So there are three aspects of Paul's service in a global world that we can draw from this passage. His service was inclusive. It's very difficult to minister in our current world without being inclusive. It's innovative, creative in new ministries, but faithful to the gospel, and intentional. He didn't just wait for it to happen, but took costly steps to make sure this happened. So what was Paul's motivation for doing this? Well, if you look at the end of this section, 1 Corinthians 8-10, which is one of the major sections of 1 Corinthians, Paul ends with the words in 1 Corinthians 11:1, where he says the words, let me just get that to you, sorry. In chapter 11, verse 1, Paul says, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ," or imitate me as I imitate Christ. In other words, all that Paul was trying to do at Corinth in becoming all things to all people is in some small way to imitate and to be like Jesus. So why is Paul inclusive? Well, it's because if Jesus died for the sins of the world, who is Paul and who are we to exclude them? Why is Paul innovative? Well, because Jesus went out of his way, going from heaven to earth, the word becoming flesh for our salvation. I think that's quite innovative, isn't it? And why was he intentional? was because Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem and sacrificed his own life for all people. He became poor so that we could become rich. So how is it that we can't put ourselves out for others and for their salvation? So the motivation for Paul was a gospel motivation. It was a Jesus motivation. And Paul calls us to do the same, to be imitators of him as he imitates Jesus. So as we think about COVID-19, but also these other changes happening in the world that are impacting our cities and our neighborhoods, my prayer is that out of this time, we as individuals and as churches would take the opportunity to think more about how our world is changing, how our neighborhoods are changing, and adapting our lives and ministries in wonderful ways for the sake of the gospel. Now we're going to have opportunity for questions, but before we do that, I've been asked to say a few words about the Master of Missional Leadership degree at MST. This is really just a program for anyone out there who, regardless of your vocational setting, you might be a pastor, you might be a mission leader, you might be in the workplace or a teacher. For anyone who would really like to grow in their capacity to not just serve, but also to lead others to serve Jesus in this global world. Currently, we have men and women from all kinds of vocational settings on the course, are all concerned about serving Jesus in mission. And if you think God is calling you to be better equipped to serve Jesus in this global world, and to do that and you want to do that with others in this community and who are on the same journey, do get in touch with me. I'd love to hear from you. And it's worth mentioning that even if you don't have a theological degree, there is still a pathway for you to get onto the program. So don't let that stop you if you're thinking of getting in touch. Now I'm going to hand over to Sue now for our question and answer time.
Oh, David, thank you so much. Those three I's, so important: inclusive, innovative, and intentional. A lot of life wrapped up in that and a lot that we can learn. So thank you so much for that presentation. Really appreciate that, David. So timely and so important. Just 3 questions have come in that I will pose to you. And if you're listening, other questions come up, please post your question in the Q&A space using that icon, and we can bring those to David as well. But David, first of all, how can we be intentional about adapting when for so long our churches have been used to doing things in a certain way?
Yeah, that's a big question. And there are a lot of churches that, and for all of us really, for all of our ministries, there's a tendency where we can just go into autopilot and just do things the way they've always been done. And what sometimes makes it hard is if we have enough people coming through the doors that we think we convince ourselves that there's no reason for change and there's no need to adapt. But I think maybe drawing us back into the passage, one of the things that is important to point out is that, for our churches, it's very important to help them understand, as we've seen in the passage, that the call to adapt is something that is a gospel imperative. Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Jesus. So I think the first thing is to really speak to the church about going back to the gospel and seeing this as not as an optional extra as such, but really as something that the Bible calls us to do and as part of what Jesus did for us. And so I think that would be perhaps one of the first things that I'd say. Often it's a long process, and I've been in a lot of those discussions myself about helping churches navigate this kind of change. But I think one of the first things I would like to say is that this isn't just a thing that we do, it's a gospel thing. It's a Jesus thing that we need to do.
That sounds kind of like the theoretical part of it, that this is why we're doing it. But now the next question brings it home in a very, very practical way. This question says, what practical first steps can churches take if they want to adapt their ministries to new realities?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that in terms of practical first steps, one of the, again, there's a tendency that we can get into program mode and just to think that we've got to have this or that program. And often what I would like to, one of the first steps I would like to say is that we need to understand the areas in which we minister. And to put it another way, to really think about what God is doing in our own context and to find out about that, whether that's thinking with other churches and Christians in the area and understanding what's going on and what is not going on, what is going on socially and economically, what is going on in terms of religious communities in the area. And to really take the first step of listening, really, I would say, in terms of what God is doing in the area and where are the great needs. And so I would say that if we want to adapt, we've got to know what's there first and to understand the place in which God has put us and situated us in. So I'd say first steps would be to try to encourage brothers and sisters in the congregation and in the church to be mobilized to understand and listen and to pray about what God is doing in the area, to grant us understanding and to grant us wisdom from that to know how we should adapt. And then we can think about what sort of things we should do in the church rather than just saying we've got to have this group just like any other church has. And that, I think, allows for a lot of creativity.
Thank you, David. Okay, here's a question. Can you give more practical examples of being innovative in our ministry to other religions, cultures, atheists, that kind of a context?
So could you say that again? Sorry, Sue. Can you give
Sure.
examples?
Can you give more practical examples of being innovative in our ministry to other religions, other cultures, perhaps to atheists, that sort of thing?
Okay, thank you. Well, that kind of touches on one of the things that I was just saying about connecting with our areas and taking practical steps to knowing what is going on in the area. I think in terms of other religions, atheists, whichever group that we're talking about, it's a question of whether we, say as a church or individuals, decide to invest resources and time into making that an important part of our ministries. So, you know, I'm teaching currently a course on living faiths, and we're talking about all sorts of groups that are moving into Melbourne. One person's writing about a Somali group. And I remember there being examples in the past of being in churches where ministers haven't been willing to always, when they see a new, quite a large community of a religious group move in, how they're not willing to adapt the culture of their church to accommodate those groups. They didn't want to change the way they did evangelism or had evangelistic gatherings and the like. So I think that this, when people move into our areas, it raises big questions to think about: are we willing to change even the culture of the church to some extent, in order that we can accommodate some of these groups that are moving into our area, because our area is changing. Yeah. And so that's just one example.
Thanks, David. Okay, another question. This has more to do, a little more general in scope. What skills and training are needed for work in a mission organization, and what pathways does MST offer for that?
There are, one of the things that we're becoming more convinced of, and I'm certainly convinced of, is that in terms of cross-cultural and training for cross-cultural mission, given the kind of world that we live in, this is really something that is essential, not just for people who are going overseas in cross-cultural mission, but even for the pastor today. who is ministering in a suburb that is quite diverse. And so, but in terms of, you were asking if the question is about mission organizations, each mission organization have their own requirements, so you have to ask them specifically about those. But with MST, we're offering quite a number of not just explicitly mission-related subjects for us to, but we're always committed to a kind of two areas of training. And one is, first of all, understanding the world in which we live, understanding this global world that we live. So we try to give people the tools to be equipped for understanding the world. But there's also important for Christians to be equipped in understanding God's word and working out how those two things can be brought together as we engage in cross-cultural mission today. And so that is those two strands are strands that go through our subjects and through MST. If there are pathways, if the question is about pathways, there are, I think you can ask some of those questions in more detail to some of the in the inquiries chat room.
Thanks. That's a great reminder that our inquiries team is available today to chat live at any point. So thanks, David. One more question. Is engaging in cross-cultural holistic mission an optional extra for Christians? What do you think about that?
Well, I think, again, and I'll just come back to our passage just to reinforce the point. But I don't think Paul considered it to be an optional extra at Corinth. And I think he said that as long as there are people out there, whoever they are, from whatever background, we are there to share Christ in word and deed with them. And so I think that, again, it comes down to a gospel issue, and that Paul is talking about here. And I think that just in terms of the way our world is changing, I think some people used to could perhaps try to justify cross-cultural holistic mission as an optional extra when sort of maybe a generation or two ago, if you're living in a Western country. But I think that is becoming increasingly hard even in Western countries, given global migration and changing demographics. So I think that most pastors graduating from college or becoming ministers in churches these days will inevitably face some kind of diversity, whether that's religious, ethnic, or socioeconomic in their pastoral situations.
Yeah. Well, this is a good follow-up question then, David. This person who has written says, we are an ethnic church where we used to be quite exclusive, but now we're trying to be more inclusive. How can we encourage our members, especially the older members in our church, who have trouble adapting to other cultures?
Mm.
Well, that's a big one, isn't it?
It is a big one. And I'll just say a couple of things. I think the first thing, again, is that we, those of us who are concerned and can see the reasons and the gospel reasons behind this, need to model this just as Paul modeled it, first of all, to the Corinthians. And so, first of all, is to model that willingness to become more inclusive in our neighborhoods. The second thing I would say is also that partnerships with other churches are very significant, because every church, we all have our blind spots, and we can all tend to the default position of ministering to people who are like ourselves. And but one of the things that is happening in local as well as global mission is that people are talking a lot more about partnerships with Christians, non-Western Christians in the countries that we go to, as well as partnerships with non-Western immigrant churches here in Australia. And I think that sometimes each church will have different resources that the other one doesn't have. And we can share insights and learn from each other. and find ways of partnering in the local area rather than just assuming that we are just going to stick to our own ministries and we'll never meet. And so I would encourage you to model that example of inclusiveness in our own lives and ministries, and to keep raising it as an issue, and also to think about partnerships with other churches in the area.
David, thank you so much. That's the final question I have for you, and we just appreciate your time today. Thank you, David.
Wonderful.
Thank you all for joining us today for today's virtual open day for MST and Eastern. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar with Dr. David Ung. I hope also you'll stay on to hear some of the other presentations. We have a variety of webinars happening throughout the day. So check out the Open Day homepage to see what else is on offer today and join in. There's also remind you that there's that live chat if you have particular questions regarding a program, regarding study at MST or Eastern. I hope you'll take that opportunity to talk with one of our inquiries team today. At the bottom of the Open Day page, there's also a connection form, and we would love for you to take a moment to fill that out, and so that we can keep you updated on what's happening at MST and Eastern. Again, thanks so much for being with us. Hope you have a wonderful day, and may God bless you as you consider the potential of study at MST and Eastern. Bye for now.